All right, so we're going to talk about the integration of Ole Miss, 1962. We got to get a little bit of backstory. Colleges across the South were starting to integrate. Probably most famously, University of Mississippi and University of Alabama. The governors worked to block the integration of those schools. Okay, the governor of Mississippi in 1962, his name was Ross Barnett. And if you look at a map of central Mississippi, you see Ross Barnett's name because they named a big old lake after him. The Ross Barnett Reservoir outside of Jackson, Mississippi is named after him. Okay? He was a segregationist. And he was sort of elected as being a segregationist. I want you to understand, segregation became one of those big election issues. If you wanted to get elected in the South during the 1950s and 1960s, you had better have been a segregationist. That's just the way it was at that time. And Ross Barnett, that was what he got elected on. Okay? Well, when Kennedy becomes president, they work on plans to integrate the colleges and universities. Okay? And Ross Barnett and Kennedy, they had done some negotiations. And the NAACP, they picked a candidate to be the first to integrate the University of Mississippi. One of the little-known things is the man who we give credit for integrating Ole Miss was not the first African-American student at Ole Miss. During World War II, the Army actually sent people to universities to get specialized training. And actually, during World War II, there was an African-American student, but that's sort of kind of lost to history because of the way this was handled. Okay, Governor Ross Barnett, he was a segregationist. Okay, there was a man named James Meredith. Okay, James Meredith, he was an African American who wanted to attend wanted to become a lawyer. And at that point, Ole Miss was the only law school in the state of Mississippi. Okay. Currently, we have two. Mississippi College has a law school too. So James Meredith is an African American. He had been a veteran of the U.S. Army. He was a non-traditional college student. Now, what's a non-traditional college student? Does anybody know what that is? That would be like somebody a little bit older going back and going to college. Okay, let's say, like I know you have a plan to go into the trades, right? Okay, well that's fantastic. We need people to go into the trades, but you might get tired of working in the trades. So let's say when you're 25, 26 years old, you've worked in the trades, and now maybe you want to go and get a business degree so you can run your own bit. You see what I'm saying? So you would be a non-traditional college student. A traditional college student is somebody straight out of high school. Okay, so James Meredith, he was a little bit older. Okay, and the NAACP backed him in trying to get him to register. He actually tried a couple of times. He tried to register in the registrar's office for Ole Miss that's in downtown Jackson. There's still a registrar's office there, and so he went there, and he went with all of the paperwork that he needed. And who was in there but the governor of Mississippi? He was there, and he said, "I'm sorry, you cannot register. That is against the law of Mississippi. I swore an oath to uphold the law of Mississippi, and therefore you will not go." And this started a court battle and started negotiations with the Kennedy administration to get him registered. Okay, and they worked out a plan that they would register him, but they would register him in Oxford. And at that time, and this is something that's very hard for us to imagine, football games, if they were a big football game, they were not played in Oxford, and Mississippi State did not play theirs in Starkville. They played in the largest stadium in the state, which is the Veterans Memorial Stadium in Jackson, Mississippi. That football is pretty huge. In fact, y'all can thank football for us having a new state flag. Did you know that? The governor took no action on changing the state flag until the SEC threatened to not allow our schools to participate in their sports.
That's that boy Colin Hill.
Okay? So, football is very, very important. Well, like I said, those big games, they weren't played in the stadium. There were stadiums at the colleges. They just were not very large stadiums. Okay? And in the 1940s, Mississippi had built a big stadium for this purpose in Jackson. So big rival games were played in Jackson. And one of the big rivals for the University of Mississippi, Ole Miss, was the University of Kentucky. Not as big a rival now, but it's still somewhat a rival. Well, they were playing on Saturday. Well, the plan was that James Meredith, while all these people were at the football game, that they would get James Meredith somewhere on campus so that he could register when the registrar's office opened up. Okay? Well, at that football game, Ross Barnett, at halftime, the band was on the field. Ross Barnett walks out to the 50-yard line, and he gives a speech. They call it the I Love Mississippi speech, because he walks out and he says, I love Mississippi. But he's got that old Southern drawl, so it's like, I love Mississippi. And the crowd does what? What do you think the crowd does when the governor says, I love Mississippi? Woo! And there's film of this, and the camera pans the crowd, and it's just, the stadium's packed. Everybody's screaming. And before they banned it, back in the, I think, early 90s, they banned a tradition that had been a tradition at Ole Miss, which was to bring your flag and wave your flag in the stands. Of course, the flag is the rebel flag, right? So you just see all these rebel flags waving in the stadium. It's like, oh, that crowd, we know where they stand, right? Well, his first line is, I love Mississippi. The second line is, I love her people. Okay, all right. I love her customs. Now, what customs do you think he's talking about?
White people.
Segregation. That's the customs. And then he says, I'll do whatever it takes to defend it. And the crowd goes wild. Ole Miss wins the game. And meanwhile, James Meredith has been put on campus. Well, word got out that James Meredith was on campus. So picture all these, happy people driving, the game was won. It's about a 3-hour drive, because there's no interstate at that point, about a 3-hour drive from Jackson to Oxford. Meanwhile, word has gotten around Lafayette and Pontotoc County that James Meredith is on campus at Ole Miss. So now you have all these folks from Pontotoc and Lafayette County coming to campus. And they're upset. Well, Kennedy had ordered 50 U.S. Marshals to go to Ole Miss to help keep order. Okay? So all these folks come to town, and they see all these federal agents standing around. How happy are they with that? They're not. Essentially, a riot breaks out. A riot breaks out, and these people that are there start taking shots at the federal agents. Federal agents are taking cover. They're ordered not to shoot back, even though they're being shot at. Cars are burned in the circle. Have any of y'all been to Ole Miss? Been down there? The Lyceum's sort of the center of campus. That's the building they always show. It's got the little bullet hole. Well, it's a big bullet hole. It's about that big around in the door from the Civil War. There's a circle, and they call it the circle that goes up in front of it. Well, all the cars that were parked there ended up burning up, and 2 people ended up getting shot and killed in this situation. One was a journalist that was covering this, and the other one It wasn't a marshal, but it was somebody else that was there. Several marshals were injured, that kind of thing. This was just crazy, all over him. Well, Kennedy ends up having to call in the Army. He can't call the Mississippi National Guard. Why not?
Because they with them.
The Mississippi National Guard, until the governor gives the president the use of the Mississippi National Guard, the governor is the commander of them. So this riot goes on because Kennedy actually had to bring in Army that was in Arkansas, and I think there's a base near Little Rock they had to come from. So it was like a 4.5 hour trip that this riot was going on. Okay, when the Army comes, everything calms down. Okay, but this violence, just to get one man into Ole Miss, 2 people died. All this shooting, all this property damage, all this kind of stuff to get him in there. He did register and he did go. The thing was, he was a student, so the school was integrated, right?
Some more people start coming.
The thing was, a lot like Little Rock, they did not shut down.
Give him a schedule.
They didn't shut down school. No, they gave him a schedule. He was in classes by himself. One student. But he was there. He said, now eventually more students come and that kind of thing. And you know what? It's kind of an interesting thing. There wasn't any uproar to speak of when that first African American player played football for the Rebels. But James Meredith, he wasn't an athlete. He wanted to be a lawyer. And actually, I don't even know that he finished at the University of Mississippi or not. He did become a lawyer, and he actually ran for governor a couple of times. I think he's still alive. But we're going to talk about him a little bit more. But the integration of Ole Miss, this made national news. Again, Mississippi, remember I told you yesterday, we have a little bit of a reputation. This is from long ago. I wasn't alive during this, okay? My oldest brother wasn't even alive during this. And my parents weren't married or anything. But, we're still dealing with that sort of stigma. And I tell you what, ever watch ESPN 30 for 30? Okay, there's a great one about Ole Miss in 1962. I'm trying to think of the name of it. But essentially, that year the football team went undefeated. But they didn't get the accolades they did because of this going on. If I'll try and find it. I don't know if it's still on Netflix or not, but I've got ESPN, the app. I'll try and find the name of it because it is a really interesting one. And I know particularly y'all football players would be interested in it. So, but Ross Barnett, he goes on, he ends up being reelected. They name a big lake after him. There has been some movement to rename that lake, maybe one day. Because whenever I see that name, I grew up right by it too. I think of that speech, and I'll try and find a film of it. So maybe on Friday I can show it to you a little bit of him giving that speech. But this was a big deal. This was violent, just so one man can go to college at Ole Miss. And people say, well, why didn't he go to his university? What universities are we talking about?
Black universities.
Yeah, right, the HBCUs, right? Which Mississippi actually has more of them than many states do. They say, what's wrong with that program? Well, what was wrong with that program for him?
There was no law school.
There's no law school. There was no law school. So, any questions there? All right. So, let's go on to 1963.
Let's go.
Okay, 1963, there were a couple of big events that went on. We're going to start a little bit earlier. One of the saddest things, we had what's called the Birmingham campaign.
When it was burning churches and stuff.
That actually happened a little bit later. The Birmingham campaign, this had to do with, it started as a boycott.
When did that Mississippi burning stuff start happening?
That's 1964. We'll get there.
Okay.
It started as a boycott of segregated stores. Okay, the Birmingham campaign. Birmingham was probably one of the most segregated cities in the South. They actually they zoned where you could live. Okay, so basically you had truly a white part of town where only whites could buy houses. Then you had, well, they called it the colored part of town, where everybody else could buy houses.
So could a white person buy a house on the colored part?
I suppose they could, but it was generally so it would be like a rental house. The thing is, Birmingham had a nickname. They called it Bombingham. Birmingham's economy boomed after World War II because of the steel industry there. And the city, as it grew, they wouldn't zone more areas for African Americans to buy homes. Okay? So as more and more people are moving in to get these jobs in the steel industry, there's not houses available for African American families. So while it was zoned that way, a property owner could sell their property to whoever they wanted to. Okay? So some African American families did attempt to buy homes in the white zoned area of town. But when they did that,
Birmingham.
basically people would put bombs under the front porches of the houses and blow them up. I mean, this was violent that was going on, okay? And that kind of started this. The Birmingham campaign started as a boycott of segregated stores. The police commissioner was a guy named his name was Bull Connor. Okay, he made the situation worse. Essentially, the stores, because they were losing money. Now, this started around springtime. Now, why do you think stores might have been hurt by a boycott? Now, we're talking department stores. Why would they be hurt by a boycott in the springtime? What is a holiday, particularly that everybody gets a new suit of clothes for? Easter. Because, even people that don't go to church much, they're the Christmas and Easter bunch, right? A lot of people are going to go to church on Easter, and you're going to have the ladies are all going to have a new dress, a new hat. Generally, the men are going to have a new suit, all that kind of stuff. Well, this was as important to these department stores as the Christmas shopping season, okay? Well, the boycott started then. So these stores said, okay, we're just going to unsegregate. So they took down their signs and everything. Well, Bull Connor, he was the police commissioner and public safety commissioner. He went and he had all the building code department. He had them condemn every building because they weren't segregated, because there weren't separate restrooms and that kind of thing. So they pulled their occupancy permit. Anytime you build a commercial space, you have to get it inspected and get an occupancy permit to be able to operate. Well, he pulled those. So if they opened, those store owners would go to jail. So they just segregated the stores again. At this point, Martin Luther King, he's leading this protest. They start a series of marches in protest of this action. Okay? Maybe you've heard of the Children's March. Okay? Well, it starts off with the parents going, and they all start off at the 16th Street Baptist Church. They have like a big meeting, and there's a big park across the street that kind of leads into what was the downtown shopping area of Birmingham. Okay? So they would leave that church, go across the park, and then march down the street in Birmingham. Okay? Well, Bull Connor said, we're just going to fill the jails. So he literally would arrest everybody that was marching. Martin Luther King Jr. famously was arrested. Okay? In junior English, you will read something called Letter from a Birmingham Jail that was written while Martin Luther King was arrested after doing these marches. Now, these marches, what kind of protest did we say that Martin Luther King advocated? Nonviolent civil disobedience, right? That's what his thing was. Okay? Well, his letter from a Birmingham jail is reaching out, particularly it's to these pastors around the South, saying, we need encouragement, need to keep going strong, and it questions what kind of system we live in. Okay, letter from a Birmingham jail. It is a great piece of literature, but it was written.
Didn't he get to Kennedy?
Yes.
President, yeah.
Yes, and basically they had been, this was something Kennedy was trying to keep violence down. The thing was, as these marches continue, the jails fill up, right? So they literally build pens out at the fairgrounds. They're just open with like 8-foot tall fences around them, and they just start putting people in there, kind of like cattle. Okay. But Bull Connor, they keep the marches going. He says, we'll just keep building pens, and eventually, they won't be able to march anymore. Well, the worst one was what we call the Children's March. The Children's March, these were children, high school students down to elementary students. A lot of their parents had been locked up already, okay? They decided to have a march. Now, in Birmingham, probably the thing that, and I don't have the pictures up anymore, but they would use fire hoses to stop the marchers. They used those attack dogs on people that were just literally nonviolent civil disobedience. They would lock arms and walk, and they might be singing a song or something like that. We Shall Overcome was an important civil rights song. But they'd lock arms, and they would use these fire hoses, they're called monitors, these fire cannons that shot water to break up the marchers. Okay? Well, television cameras were rolling, getting all of this. So you see these peaceful people being blown down the sidewalk by a fire hose. Or an attack dog being put on somebody who's not resisting anything. What is the student public opinion? It's television was important. I told you. So this is changing things. Well, the Children's March. The children were subjected to the same things. So you turn on the evening news and you see and these kids they dress like they wore their church clothes to do this march. They didn't want they had a reason for doing it, and you picture this like probably a little 2nd or 3rd grade little girl in her Sunday go to meeting clothes, little frilly dress and the little shoes and stuff on, and you see her get blown down the sidewalk on fire hose with fire hose.
He killed some of those people.
I mean, it could definitely injure you. This does not feel good. Okay, so think about that. What does public opinion say to this? Okay, why did those kids march? Because their parents had been locked up, and they merely wanted to be able to shop in the same stores as everybody else. Now, this was a bigger part, too, dealing with the zoning and everything. Bull Connor made this much, much worse. Well, finally, Bull Connor, he actually was losing his job that year. He ran for mayor. He lost. They were changing the whole government of Birmingham because of this. But Birmingham, if you go to the Civil Rights Museum in Memphis, there's a whole section on the Birmingham campaign. And it lasted about 3.5 months.
Bull Connor's still alive?
No, he actually died pretty quick. He was an older guy, but he made that situation so much worse. Now, the Birmingham campaign, that was a huge deal. The Birmingham campaign, by the way, is probably one of the things that pushed Congress to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964 because they saw that violence. Other things, so that's the Birmingham campaign. It was a success. It was a series of marches. You need to make sure you remember the Children's March. 1963 was a big year. 1963, we've got Medgar Evers is murdered. This one's probably not even mentioned in your textbook, but we have to mention Medgar Evers. Medgar Evers was the state secretary of the NAACP or it was the Mississippi State. Okay. So basically, what Medgar Evers was doing, he was the secretary for the NAACP in the state of Mississippi. He was trying to register people to vote. Medgar Evers was working on voter registration. He was working on voter registration. It was actually in June, and he himself had tried to integrate Ole Miss back in the 50s, and it didn't really get anywhere. But he was working for voter registration. And one night he left the office and came home, and while he was getting out of his car, he got shot in the back twice. And he didn't die, but he was able to drag himself sort of to the door, under the carport, to the door of his house, where his wife had run out to, and he died in her arms. Okay? The importance of the Medgar Evers murder was it just shows the violence that's going to occur in Mississippi. Also, it's going to take almost 30 years to convict somebody. And the guy who ended up being convicted, he ended up being tried 3 times. There were 2 mistrials, and one in the 1990s. Finally, he was found guilty. His name was Byron De La Beckwith. He just could not stand that Medgar Evers was trying to register African Americans to vote. The same month that occurred, we had the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing. This was in Birmingham, Alabama, also. This happened in June, so this was a little after the Birmingham campaign had ended. The 16th Street Baptist Church was the center of the organization for the marches in Birmingham. One Sunday morning, before church, a car rode by and threw a bomb that kind of went under the front steps of the church, and it exploded. This was an older building, and the sanctuary is kind of on the second floor, and it had big steps leading up the front to go into the sanctuary. And underneath, they call it a sub-story, but basically the first floor was underneath. And under the steps on either side, there was like a door to go in to that, like a long hallway down there. And the bomb, when it was thrown, it kind of went in that little alcove by that door. So all of the pressure from the bomb was pushed through that door and down that hallway. And unfortunately, there were some little girls waiting for Sunday school to start, and these young ladies lost their lives. They were 6, 7, and 8 years old. They were just waiting for church to start, and they were the only people who died in that. There's actually a picture, there's 1 second from the window there. That's sort of the cleanup of the 16th Street Baptist Church. If you ever go to Birmingham, there are so many civil rights sites to see. 16th Street Baptist Church is still an active church. Across the street from it is the Birmingham Civil Rights Interpretive Center. And it is definitely worth going to see. They never convict anybody of this bombing. They do know that it was some KKK members, but they never get them. Now, this bombing this prompts further push for the Civil Rights Act. All of these things are building us closer and closer to it. And probably the biggest, that was in June of 1963. Probably the biggest event of the Civil Rights Movement is going to occur in 1963, and that's the March on Washington. That was in September of 63. Okay. March on Washington, it was organized by A. Philip Randolph.
He's still 63.
Yeah. Like I said, 63's probably got more things than any other year. March on Washington was organized by A. Philip Randolph. It was a march in support of passage of the Civil Rights Act. It actually lasted a couple of days, but the most famous and most remembered event of this was a speech by Martin Luther King. I want you to understand, all those people didn't come there to hear Martin Luther King speak. They didn't. They came to support passage of this law. Martin Luther King was not the only speaker. He is the most remembered because he gives his most iconic speech, I Have a Dream. You know that wasn't the first time he gave that speech?
Yeah.
He had used it as a sermon in a church in Illinois. So it wasn't the first time, but it fit perfectly for what they were doing, okay? Because his speech is all about the dream of equality. And in there he talks about his girls being able to go to the amusement park and that kind of thing. So it's a very great speech, but there was music, there was lots of speeches. But that iconic speech, I Have a Dream. Have any of you been to Washington, D.C.? Do any of y'all go?
Take us.
Hmm?
Do you think he actually had a dream? Like, about this?
I think he's a preacher and he could deliver a really good sermon. But in front of the Lincoln Memorial where he gave that speech, if you go there today, there's a big circle cut out and it says on this spot, on this date, Martin Luther King delivered the I Have a Dream speech.
It should say Martin.
And it's really, really, to me, it's really, really cool to stand in that spot and have seen the footage and be able to visualize all the people. You had over 300,000 people there for this march. That's a lot of people. Okay, this was a completely peaceful march to prompt Congress to pass that law. Okay, now just a couple of months later, of course, that's overshadowed by an assassination. Okay, we know November '63.
MLK was assassinated.
Nope, Kennedy is assassinated. All right, so that changes things, okay? When Kennedy is assassinated, guess what? Those laws that he wanted passed start to get moving through Congress. Lyndon Johnson is able to push things through Congress. He's very good at that. So we're going to move on into 1964. But 63, there was a whole lot of stuff that happened in 63. The Birmingham campaign. We talked about Medgar Evers being murdered. The reason I mentioned Medgar Evers, there's a good chance he's going to be on your state test. Mississippi, our history standards, what they do is they throw in Mississippi stuff wherever they can. So Emmett Till probably going to be on there. Medgar Evers probably going to be on there too. Okay, 16th Street Baptist Church bombing. That was just a sad thing. And actually, if you go there across the street, there's a statue. It's a park bench, and it's a statue of those little girls sitting on that bench like they were waiting for church to start. And that was a really sad thing to see, because those little girls were innocent. At that age, how did they get tied up in all that? Just somebody threw a bomb in there, making a point. The thing is, the more violent it becomes, the more people turn against the segregation.
Were
Okay.
Were they time bombs or were they like remote control?
That one, I think it was literally, it had like a fuse or something. It was because a car drove by and threw it out the window. So, all right. So let's move into 1964. 1964 is a big year too. So, right? Everybody good? With at least this part.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, if you want credit, you want to put that in the phone spot. I do take notes as I'm standing up here of who's holding what. All right, so let's move into 64.
I feel 90.
64, we have some big things happen. This is where some of the goals of the overarching movement are finally met. Okay?
I used to think that Martin Luther King got murdered after Kennedy.
It was after, but it was several years after. Now, there was another Kennedy that gets assassinated the same year, but we'll get there. Okay? 1964. Okay, the biggest thing we have, the biggest law passed of the civil rights movement is the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Okay, this bans discrimination on basis of race, creed, nationality, gender, and religion in public places. Okay, Civil Rights Act. It bans discrimination. Now, essentially what this does is it bans all segregation in public places. Okay? In public places. So you can't have segregation in the department store. You can't have segregation in the restaurant, the movie theater, all that kind of thing.
But ain't those private places, like they owned by somebody?
No, they're open to the public.
Yeah. So can you have it
Private would be like
A private school is not necessarily a public place because you have to, and they fixed that. I'll tell you how some of those schools did. For private schools, some schools, they require you to buy stock in that school so that you are an owner of it if you have children enrolled in that school. So therefore, it is a private place, that kind of like a members only kind of thing.
So that means they couldn't kick you out.
That's right. And actually, that's why a lot of country clubs became members only, because then they could determine who could play golf or tennis or whatever. Also, I saw something like this come up a few years ago when they banned smoking in public places in South Haven in restaurants, right? They banned smoking unless it's on the patio. Well, there were a couple of little bars in the older part of South Haven. One's called it's not a bar, but it's the pool hall. It's called the Silver Q. Obviously, smoking is something that usually would happen at a pool hall or a bar. And these places said that, banning smoking would hurt their business, which very well may be. But to do that, because the ordinance banned something in public places. Well, to be able to do that, to allow smoking in there, it would have to become a private club. They would have to change their designation. So you would have to essentially buy a membership in that club. And there's ways around it. Like I don't know if they actually did that or not, but well, now you have to actually buy a membership. So you would have to, buy $1 membership or whatever, and then you could go in. I know I've had to deal with the American Legion in Horn Lake a couple of times. They sponsor Boys State. Well, the American Legion is a private club. You have to be a veteran essentially, and prove you're a veteran to be able to go in there, or be a guest of a veteran to be able to go in there. And I walked in there, and the cigarette smoke was probably at this level. So you're like coughing as you're wading through there, but it's because it was a private club.
Did you
And
smoke in high school?
The what?
Did you smoke in high school?
That's neither here nor there right now. All right, so let's get back to the Civil Rights Act. So it banned discrimination in public places. So some of those public places became private clubs. Things like public pools, and actually a lot of cities just closed their public pools because of integration. They used to have wade-ins to wade in the public pools and that kind of thing for integration. But the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is probably the most important act passed during this time period. Now, also in 1964, we have the passage of the 24th Amendment. 24th Amendment to the Constitution. What this does is it outlaws the poll tax. Hey, that was one of the major goals of the Civil Rights Movement, was to outlaw the poll tax, wasn't it? So now in 1964, they got it. All right, 1964, that is an election year. If it's an election year, what do you think the main focus is going to be? Discrimination is ended, essentially, right? As far as de jure segregation is ended by this law. Now they shift their focus to voter registration. It's a presidential election year. That's the year that Johnson ran against Goldwater, right? We talked about that. Johnson's going to win a landslide. Well, so the push is voter registration, particularly in the South. We have what's called Freedom Summer. Again, remember, they're going to ask you Mississippi questions on the Mississippi History State Test, right? Well, Freedom Summer was a voter registration drive in the state of Mississippi in the summer of 1964. Okay? This is a voter registration drive. The summer of 1964. College students from all over the country came to Mississippi to try and register folks to vote. You know, I told you about that book, Coming of Age in Mississippi. That's what Ann Moody worked on. She worked on voter registration drive. Let me see if I have a copy of it. I was just trying to find a copy of it so I can show you. All right, so this voter registration drive in Mississippi. Remember I told you about Vernon Damer, how his house got burned down? That was in 1964 because he tried to help people register to vote. One guy tried to register to vote, got murdered in plain sight in Macomb, Mississippi, and they just sort of left his body laying there. There's probably the most shocking were 3 people who were murdered in Neshoba County, Mississippi. You talked about Mississippi Burning earlier. That movie is based on the Neshoba County murders. There were 3 guys that worked in voter registration. And one thing that occurred in 1964 as a part of Freedom Summer is several churches were burnt down. These churches actually had been helping with this voter registration drive. One of those was in Neshoba County. And these 3 young men went to they had spoken in that church just a day or 2 before, and they went to talk to the pastor and essentially offer condolences for the church being burnt down. And after that, they disappeared. It was James Chaney, who was an African-American man from Meridian, Mississippi. Then you had Andrew Goodman, who was a guy from New York. He had actually only been in Mississippi for about 2 days. He was a college student who would come down to help with voter registration drive. And then you had Michael Schwerner, who had been an organizer in Meridian, but he was also from New York. Well, basically, they go up missing, and the FBI is looking for them. It's one of the largest missing persons cases, and people suggested that these guys had just run off and gone to Mexico or something like that. Well, then, like 6 weeks later, a man working at the power company, he sees a car sticking out of this pond. The power company was running a new power line, and the power line had to kind of cross this pond, so they had to lower the level of the water so they could get their equipment to put the power pole in. And when they lowered the water, this car was the roof of this car was showing in the water. So they retrieved it, and it was these guys' missing car. It had been burned. There were no bodies in the car. So they started searching around for the bodies, and they actually got a witness. We don't find out till later, but somebody told them where to look for the bodies. This pond hadn't been built for very long, and the bodies are found buried in the dam of the pond, and they had been shot, all 3 of them. This is another case that it takes almost 40 years before someone is convicted for this. That's a guy named Edgar Ray Killen. He finally gets convicted in 2003 for this. Now, he wasn't necessarily the one who pulled the trigger, but he was the Klan leader who ordered them picked up, and they essentially got kidnapped. They had sheriff's deputies pull them over. They kidnapped them, took them to this remote location, beat them up, and then Edgar Ray Killen said, "End it," and they ended up getting shot.
Say he was about to die by the time they called.
Well, that's the thing. He was almost 90 years old. He went to trial every day. He was in a wheelchair. He was on oxygen, and they tried to get him his sentence suspended. He got life in prison. Now, granted, it wasn't going to be very long, but they tried to get that suspended because he was ill, and he had become his nickname was the preacher back then, but he had actually pastored churches and things like that. And he said, well, you know, he's changed. He went to prison and died in prison. So this was a horrible thing. And there's a great book about this whole thing called We Are Not Afraid. But that movie, Mississippi Burning, while that movie is fictional, actually, if you ever watch that movie, they call it Jessup County. They changed all the names of all these places because when that movie was made back in the 80s, a lot of those people were all still alive. But that was a very violent thing that happened during Freedom Summer. Okay, so Freedom Summer is important. Also, 1964, we have what's called the Selma March.
The bloodiest march of all time.
The Selma March. Okay, that actually started. Did you know that protest actually started because of a police shooting of an African American young man. Basically, this young man had been shot by the police. Nothing had been done to the police, so that march, a peaceful, nonviolent march, was going to march through Selma and across the Alabama River at Selma. And they were going to march from Selma to Montgomery to, for justice for this young man. And the big issue they had was that the sheriff, an elected position, the sheriff was not responsive to what they asked him to do. And it was because the African Americans had no voice in that election because they were effectively disenfranchised. So this march, while it started as, looking for justice for that young man, now it's pushing for voting rights so that the elected officials will be responsive to the African Americans. And as they cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge, which is still there in Selma, the bridge goes up because years ago when it was built, the Alabama River was used for commerce. So ships boats had to go under it. So that bridge goes up and over. Well, they were crossing out of Selma, going across the bridge. What they didn't realize was there was a big roadblock of highway patrolmen at the other side. Now, this is a peaceful march. So as they come across that bridge, they look down and see those highway patrolmen. Well, what do? They say, well, I guess we're done. No, they locked arms and kept going. Okay? When they get to the bottom of the bridge to the highway patrolmen just go with their batons and just start beating those folks. Okay? Trying to stop them. Okay? And they do stop them that day. But then Martin Luther King comes to town, and we do have a Selma to Montgomery march. And it's in support of voting rights. And they literally march and they camp out. They actually, there's a whole lot of really good literature if you can read about that. But it's essentially 60 miles from Selma to Montgomery, and they march there. They want to march to the state capitol to demand voting rights. The Selma campaign and Freedom Summer, all of these things help push for something in 1965. We call it the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So all these things lead up to 1965, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. All right, so Voting Rights Act of 1965. This is important because what this does, this outlaws the literacy test. Okay, it only applies to states that have a literacy test in place. Now, it keeps other states from putting one in place, but it actually only applies to 13 states that had a literacy test.
Mississippi.
Okay, Mississippi was one. Essentially, it's all the southern states, including Kentucky. Yes. Mhm. Okay.
So where does that, like, what is the southern part cut off in?
Depends who you ask. Generally, you say once you get north of the Ohio River, you're out of the South. Okay. This outlaws the literacy test. Also, it requires federal approval for voting requirement changes. Or poll changes. Okay? Now again, this applies only to 13 states because those 13 states actually still had the literacy test. It also keeps any states from being able to put in a literacy test. Okay? Mississippi was under this actually until this law ends up, not the whole thing, but parts of this law end up being declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. But that happened in 2014, I think. So this law was on the books for quite a while. But it did allow for voting rights. So at this point, the Civil Rights Movement in 1965, they have reached two of their major goals, right? They've outlawed discrimination in public places. Now they've gotten rid of the poll tax and equalized voting rights. So that's a big thing. But here is where it starts to get a little dicey for the Civil Rights Movement, okay? We've got to talk about a guy named Malcolm X. Okay? Some of you have heard of Malcolm X. I hope all of you have heard of Malcolm X. Okay? Malcolm X was actually born Malcolm Little. He went to prison for stealing cars when he was 15, I think. And while he was in prison, he converted to Islam. He joined a group called the Nation of Islam. Okay? And he changed his name to Malcolm X. He did away with his slave name, as he called it. Okay? Malcolm X, he joined the Nation of Islam.
You know that's the only book I read about his life.
Okay? The Nation of Islam was led by a guy named Elijah Muhammad. Okay? Now, the thing about the Nation of Islam, it's known as the Black Muslims. They got most of their converts from prison. Elijah Muhammad, he took Islam and he sort of twisted what it said to make it work for him. Okay? The Nation of Islam, they weren't sort of true Islamic followers. Essentially what Elijah Muhammad had created was kind of like a gang. And Malcolm, he became one of their imams, one of their pastors, okay? And he spoke very much about what's called black separatism. What do you think black separatism is? Black separatism is the idea that African Americans should separate from white society and create their own society and make their own decisions. And he advocated violence for this. It's okay. Until about 1963, he went on the Hajj. Do you know what the Hajj is for a Muslim? The Hajj is the required pilgrimage to Mecca. Okay? All Muslims should, if they can, during their life, they're supposed to go on the Hajj. It's a pilgrimage to Mecca so they can pray to Allah at the place where Allah touch the earth. That's what Mecca
Is
is.
it the box thing?
Yeah, the Kaaba.
Yeah.
The Kaaba is that's the spot where Allah touched the earth. And so Muslims every year during the month of Ramadan, they go and millions of people go to the city of Mecca and they pray at the Kaaba. Well, Malcolm did the Hajj like a Muslim's supposed to, and he had an epiphany. What's an epiphany? You remember what an epiphany is?
I thought.
It's like a insight. Think of like the little light bulb in a cartoon. Bing, got the idea, right? He looked around while he was praying there in Mecca, and he saw every race of the world represented in that group of Muslims. He said, wow, every race, they're unified in this one thing, peacefully. They're not elbowing each other. They're not fighting for a spot. Everybody's there. And after that, he actually broke with the Nation of Islam. He split from them because he didn't agree with the message they were sending. He said, okay, here's what we've got to do. He switched from talking about black separatism. He said, we've got to use the ballot so we don't have to use the bullet. He called it ballots or bullets. He said, we got to vote. We got to vote to make change so we don't have to use the bullets to force change. And after, not too long after that, he ended up being murdered by the Nation of Islam.
Sounds like a mafia.
Like I said, the Nation of Islam was more of a gang and a criminal enterprise than anything. One of those, once you're in, there's only one way out.
Seniors, class change, CTC.
All right, guys, on USA Test Prep, you have 2 assignments. State Test Review 3, State Test Review 3A. Make sure you're getting those done.